Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Department of Sociology and Anthropology, I would like to welcome you all to our colloquium on food regimes, life world's enclosure, and planetary crisis. Let me acknowledge from the outset that SFU occupies the territory of Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. I am Yıldız Atasoy, Professor of Sociology and Director of Center for Sustainable Development at SFU. Our MA student, Gabby Arana, will assist us reading your questions at the end of the presentation. This is our second colloquium. Our first colloquium was in November. We hosted Dr. Jason Moore from Binghamton, who delivered a very interesting talk on unthinking the climate bomb, civilizational crises, class struggles, and climate history in the Holocene and beyond. You can access the talk at our departmental website. Our guest speaker today is Philip McMichael, Dr. Philip McMichael. Many of you know Phil and his work quite well already. Nevertheless, I would like to give a short introduction to his work. Dr. McMichael is Professor of Global Development at Cornell University. He is a globally well-known and highly regarded scholar of food ecology, food regimes and world economy, farming systems, food sovereignty, and various other forms of resistance movements for food system transformation in a world ecological context. He has been visiting scholar and research fellow in various prestigious institutions throughout the world, including Oxford University. He is currently focusing on China and food regime change. I'm looking forward to reading those research outcomes as well. He was chair of the political economy of world systems section of the American Sociological Association. He also served as departmental chair at Cornell. He continues to work with the civil society mechanism in the Committee on World Food Security of the UN. These are some of his service work. It's a long list and I cannot go over this right now. It will take a long time. He published numerous articles and chapters. I believe there are close to 150, many of which have become highly influential. Dr. McMichael, together with Harriet Friedman, is the founder of Food Regime Analysis, which situates food relationships in the making of the world capitalist economy and thus politicizes food. He is author or editor of 10 books. Among them are Development and Social Change, Food Regimes and Agrarian Questions, and the award-winning Settlers and the Agrarian Question. His latest co-edited book is Finance or Food. I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it very soon. On a personal note, he was the external examiner on my PhD examining committee some years ago at the University of Toronto. And I would like to take this opportunity to point out how indebted I am to Phil for his concept of incorporating comparison. The article was published in American Sociological Review in 1990. This concept has influenced much of my academic work, including my teaching. I hope you have the chance to read the articles. I make all my grad students read the article, by the way. And I would like to give a few words on the format before I pass the word to Phil. He will present his talk first, and then we will have questions and answer session after the talk. You can ask your questions anytime by posting on the question and answer box on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will try to get as many questions as possible. And I and Gabriela will read the questions for Phil to answer. We will appreciate it if you please be brief in your questions. And also, I would like to mention that the session is being recorded and will be available on our departmental webpage. And we will forward the link to you sometime soon after the talk. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our support staff. They are often behind the scenes. You don't see them, but they are on screen right now. Daisha, our essay communication coordinator, and Jeannie, who is everything in the department, really. We cannot sort of sustain our department without her, for sure. And they work very hard in organizing this and the previous event as well. I would like to thank them here. So yeah, we can now go to Phil for his presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your kind words, Yildiz. And I guess the relationship is turned. You can now be my external examiner. Okay. So I'm going to, I can't see anybody, but I'm looking forward to seeing your faces during question time and trying to answer the questions. So here goes. I'm going to now share the screen. Okay, so I'm going to work through some ideas that I'm developing and hope to get some good feedback in terms of where I'm heading. So just to start off with, this is just a very quick outline. I want to do a brief introduction to food regimes and then move on to talk about corporate food regime relations, which straddle the period from the 1980s up until the present. And then talk about the long food ecological health crisis, which is a name I just came up with. And then finally, take a look at how the shock doctrine is addressing that particular crisis. So the food regime basically conceptualizes the cumulative processes and relationships of global food provisioning. And there are three phases, as some of you know, of geopolitical hegemony. Each food regime has a distinctive phase of capitalism's political history. And the phases essentially were the British-dominated phase, British hegemony through imperialism and free trade, followed then after World War II by US hegemony, which is a very different nationalist kind of form of international hegemony, and the food regime took a different path in that period. And the third period is the corporate food regime during the era of neoliberalism. In the first period, and I'm just going to be very quick and dirty about this, but the first food regime essentially derived from Britain's abolition of the Corn Laws back in the 1840s. And Britain undertook an incredible experiment to offshore its food supplies to the New World, and that includes North America, countries in South America like Argentina, South Africa, and of course, Australia and New Zealand. I'm from Australia, as you can probably tell. Second food regime was organized around the United States, in particular being the sort of dominant food exporting power as the dominant power in the world anyway. And so the food that was going to Europe in the first food regime now was being redirected to third world countries in particular, and had a lot to do with establishing client regimes on the perimeter of the Cold War. The US had a surplus food aid program, which was designed to subsidize wage foods of workers in industrializing countries like Egypt and South Korea and India and Pakistan, Israel, etc. The third food regime, which starts around about the 1980s when neoliberalism began its ugly path, was a regime in which basically the global economy became the full extent or sphere, if you like, of food provisioning, firstly from the US and the European bread baskets, followed more recently by the agri-export powers such as Brazil and South Africa and Russia, India to some extent, and Vietnam and various other countries like that. And I'm going to talk about that period in much more detail as we go on. The different kinds of foods, and this is just a listing really, wage foods really characterize the British-centered food regime to provide cheap food to industrializing working classes in England and elsewhere in the continent. In the second food regime, processed foods became much more part of the whole process in addition to wage foods. And of course, today we have affluent foods, and we can talk about that if you like. Seasonal foods are part of the story as the food regime became much more global, and seasonal foods were able to provide particular kinds of fruits and vegetables all year round from different parts of the world. And then the tension that I like to talk about, the food from nowhere versus the food from somewhere. I'll come back to that later. Finally, it's important, I think, to emphasize that the food regimes across this period I'm talking about, from the mid to late 19th century right through to the present day, have involved incredible enclosure of lands and life worlds by commodification. So I want to start with a cartoon here because I think commodity fetishism is a very important concept and actually a methodological device that is really important to understand where these long supply chains, long food supply chains in particular, or biofuel supply chains in this particular case come from. And here what I'm trying to get at here is that while someone's busy being green and using ethanol based fuel for his car, that ethanol comes from the destruction of life worlds on the other side of the of Earth, and so commodity fetishism is really concealing that particular relationship. And of course, Marx used commodity fetishism as a methodological device to insist that we trace commodities back to the conditions, social and ecological, under which they're produced, and that's part of the big story. So I want to talk about the food regime as a material and discursive power complex. And first of all, enclosure via commodification, which is the large scale process that I'm going to be talking about, is justified by various discourses, which we're all familiar with. And now I'm just run through the enclosure of life worlds through the three food regime periods. First one, predominantly in indigenous peoples on settler colonial frontiers. And it's quite striking, as yielders would know, that Harriet and I didn't really pay attention to that particular issue when we were formulating the food regime sequence. And now I believe, obviously, it's very important to go back and reconstruct food regimes along those lines. Second food regime was, enclosing post-colonial rural life worlds via Green Revolution technopolitics, not everywhere, but in certain select countries like India, Pakistan, etc. And at the same time, processed and prepared foods were developing in the 50s and 60s, as those of us who were living in those times know, undermining household competences. Then finally, in the global period, the corporate food regime, peasant family farming, life worlds have been subjected to global market assault, land grabs, export agriculture and debt, livestock to factory farms, very important, seeds to bioengineering, and public health to toxins. And I'll come back to all of those as we move on. Just a quick take from Jonathan Foer's new book called Eating Animals. It's really interesting to note that 60% of earth mammals are raised for food. More than 99% of animals eaten in the US are factory farmed. Probably Canadians don't eat factory farmed meat. That's how I see Canadians. 59% of all arable land feeds livestock. And if cows were a country, they would rank third in greenhouse gas emissions after China and the US. So together, there's a terrestrial and atmospheric enclosure that is very much centered on the process of metification, as Tony Weiss would call it. This graph is quite extraordinary to look at because the top 5 meat and dairy companies combined emit more greenhouse gases than Exxon, Mobil, Shell, or BP. What I want to do here is reverse David Harvey's famous phrase, accumulation by dispossession, and argue that if we turn it around, it allows us to take a different look at what's going on. Rather than celebrating accumulation and capitalism, Harvey's not, of course, doing that, but it tends to be our focus when we talk about accumulation. I think it's very important to look the other side, and this is, of course, the methodology of the commodity fetishism, to take a look at what's being dispossessed and to refocus on what's erased, what's devalued by enclosure. Recently, just in 2016, Bruce Pascoe, an Aboriginal intellectual in Australia, wrote a book called Dark Emu, Black Seeds, Agricultural Accident, and he points out that in the book that it recovers from settler erasure, Aboriginal civilization based in landscape or soil management, and soil management, and he explains the ecological rationality of so-called prehistoric people. So he quotes, I'm quoting from him, Aboriginal people are born of the earth and individuals within the clan are responsible for particular streams, grasslands, trees, crops, animals. The life of the clan was devoted to continuance. And I think that's very important. It's something that we've lost largely. And I'm not talking about all of us, but modernity. Food regime, by contrast, is devoted to discontinuance via enclosure. So one of the things that goes on when you want to dispossess an indigenous culture is you dispossess them of their food. So in food regime 1, US frontier cattlemen, having killed off the buffalo and squeezed the Indians off the plains so they could graze their own cattle that were not ecologically appropriate to the North American plains, ranchers then turned around and sold beef to the government to feed the hungry Indians whose source of food they had eliminated. And that is the erasure of life world, or enclosure of it. In the 19th century, with white settlement, the US prairies had 16 inches of fertile loam from centuries of interaction of grasses and bison, managed by Native Americans. Now 50% of that topsoil is gone. And this I got from Tom Philpott's recent book, Perilous Bounty, Looming Collapse of American Farming and How We Can Prevent It. I haven't read it all yet, but it's quite fascinating. And as Sam Gray and Raj Patel point out, just as people have a right to their land, the land has a right to its people. And that's a very shorthand comment on the above quotes. So now I'm fast forwarding to the neoliberal era. And during the 1980s, the US had established dominance as the food exporting nation by then. But through the Marshall Plan, the US had exported its agri-technology, and Europe became another breadbasket during that period through the 70s into the 80s. And the food system was pretty volatile. And so the Uruguay round was put in place to attempt to stabilize agri-export competition for third markets across the world. And it's out of that Uruguay round that the WTO free trade regime was established. During that round, the US Agricultural Secretary, John Block, said the idea that developing countries should feed themselves is an anachronism. They could better ensure their food security by relying on US agricultural products available in most cases at lower cost. And in many ways, that sort of captures the whole relationship or structural relationship of the corporate food regime. And out of that, those discussions came the WTO and the NAFTA free trade agreements. So just a couple of slides here with graphs. This just gives us an idea of the way in which agriculture, public support of agriculture, particularly in the global south, drastically dipped in the early 90s around the time of the establishment of the World Trade Organization. This is just another angle to show the difference in subsidies towards agriculture in the global north as opposed to the global south. And remember, the agreement on agriculture that the WTO established in 1995 was designed to prohibit countries from protecting their farm sectors from imports of foodstuffs. And so that particular protocol was laid out in such a way that parts of the global north were able to conceal their subsidies of their own agricultural sectors, but at the same time break down protections in the global south. And the consequence was, of course, the incredible drop in food prices, and reaches its lowest point, of course, in 2000. But around 1995, you can see there's ups and downs, but the trend is very clear down to the beginning of the 21st century. At the same time, and because of that, food dependent countries' import dependency became quite severe, particularly in African countries. So at the Food Summit in 1966, no, it's not, yeah, 1996, sorry. Food sovereignty movement made a very dramatic intervention, which I think is fascinating to look at. The FAO produced a fairly conservative estimate at the end of the 20th century, around, in 2000, showing that in 16 states in the South, in the global South, 20 to 30 million peasants had been dispossessed, which gives you some idea of the extent of liberalization of agricultural trade that had begun in Mexico before the WTO agreement, but it was quite severe in the late 90s in particular. During that period, the South had been vulnerable to food dumping in the 1980s through to the 21st century, and the rise of agro-export platforms, because the WTO agreements encouraged investment, liberalization of investment across the world. And of course, transnational corporations have put a lot of pressure on the development institutions to open up the world economy to allow them to have access to agro-export platforms in the global South to bring food back from the South to the North. And of course, this has been exacerbating the global agrarian crisis, and the structural adjustment programs in the 1980s had been, quite influential in encouraging the withdrawal of support for small farmers. And so the agrarian crisis had been, brewing during the 80s, particularly the late 80s into the 90s, and the food sovereignty movement then got its act together and came to Rome in 1996 to point out that this crisis was threatening agroecological knowledges, seed commons, agricultural livelihoods, and land stewardship, not to mention dispossessed peasants. So the politicization of that food summit, particularly of the rhetoric of global food security to be provided by transnational food corporations, was answered with the La Via Campesina's push for food sovereignty. And by food sovereignty, I always feel that they were making a double point here. In a form of essentialism, they were talking about territorial food, and sovereignty, of course, was something that people could relate to. It was a concept in those terms that made a lot of sense. But of course, they also had the notion of food sovereignty for farming communities at the subnational level. And of course, that's become part of the food sovereignty movement across the world, as you know. As a consequence of the cheap food regime, La Via Campesina pointed out the massive movement of food around the world is forcing the increased movement of people. Farshad Araghi made a nice comment that while there was an invisible hand at work, there was a visible foot in the movement of people off the land looking for food and livelihoods elsewhere in urban centers and across borders, as we know. I have reformulated that phrasing as the massive movement of money around the world is forcing the increased movement of people. And that's the land enclosure as a consequence of financialization that became big in the 21st century, starting in the early 2000s. And you can see the the kind of the targets of land enclosure there, the ballooning, even Australia. I mean, Australia has been subject to not only English, but also China, a lot of Chinese investment in the land. About 5 years ago, I was traveling to give a talk on food regimes in Ohio, and I ran across this ad in an airport, which I thought was fascinating because it sort of captures the financialization process that was going on and the kind of corporations and firms, financial houses that were involved in that. You didn't have to be connected to the farming sector. You didn't have to know much about farming, but you could certainly raise money and invest in farming. So as a consequence, dispossession by enclosure in the 21st century has been very severe. And Julian Cribb, back in 2012, who's an Australian author in Canberra, wrote, with current trends by 2050, another 1.3 billion small farmers will be evicted. A few years later, Oxfam made the point that peasants occupy 50% of land mass, 80% of customary land tenure, which is always threatened by governments privatizing land. We need to keep that in mind. They represent more than 5,000 cultures, and 80%, they care for 80% of planet biodiversity to the extent that they can these days. Meanwhile, the World Bank was busy with satellite imagery, identifying investment-worthy sites, creating land registries, classifying land as idle or unproductive, promoting land titling, leasing for leasing or foreign direct investment. And of course, this obliterates the variety of local life worlds via distanced objective metrics. 2018, the African Development Bank, just for an example, launched African Investment Forum to leverage pension funds and other institutional investors. And there's a funny story about this because in 2010, I was at the FAO in Rome, invited to a side event where about 8 of us, eight basically academics from around the world. Ruth Hall is one person I remember. We were all talking, but the last speaker was Wendy Walford, and somehow she got stuck in Spain on the way, came in very late, but she got there just in time to get up and say, well, you know, the rest of us have been talking about land grabbing, how bad it was, so to speak. And Wendy said, well, I too am a land grabber. And everyone wondered what she was talking about. Well, she was talking about belonging to the TIA investment fund that American professors, I don't know if Canadians do, but Canadian professors and teachers, but it's a teacher investment fund that, retirement fund rather, that's been very recently very active in buying land, purchasing land in Brazil, because land's become such a big financial asset. So what's interesting about that is that there are these companies that really have no relationship to agriculture. So just summarizing, in that period, there were these two reports, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, that economic development was leading to a largely irreversible loss in the diversity of life on Earth. Effective ecosystem management had to be taking account of and taking seriously place-based knowledge, which of course, as I'll be arguing, hasn't been the case, basically. 2008, the Stratigraphy Commission of the Geological Society of London said the combination of extinctions, global species migrations, and widespread replacement of natural vegetation with agricultural monocultures is producing a distinctive contemporary biostratigraphic signal. These effects are permanent as future evolution will take place from surviving and frequently anthropogenically relocated stocks. And what's interesting about that, of course, is what we're going through now with this pandemic and the talk around the world about the problems of human boundary crossing exposing us more and more to novel animal viruses. And some of you probably know Walden Bellow's work. Presently, a lot of his work is critiquing the Belt and Road Initiative that the Chinese are building across the world. And he's arguing that it's a very dramatic exposure to wild biodiversity that hasn't been part of human commerce. And so he's very concerned about this particular problem. Now I want to just mention the food crisis in 2007, 2008, which we're all familiar with. Export bans were part of the story. And the reason I'm bringing that up right now is, as we'll see with COVID, there have been some export bans and there's been some concern about that. But this just gives you an idea of the spike in prices in 2007, 2008, and the number of export bans from so many different countries that were causing a real crisis in the supply of food and therefore rising prices. And then there's the clenched fist protests that were cascading across the world at the time. Here's a picture of some of those food riots that were going on. Now I'm switching to the shock doctrine. And I think most of you know Naomi Klein's definition, the political strategy of using large-scale crises to push through policies that systematically deepen inequality, enrich elites, and undercut everyone else. Shock doctrine was developed as a way to prevent crises from giving way to organic movements when progressive policies emerge. And I want to talk about that vis-a-vis the current situation. And the shock doctrine, she doesn't really spell this out, but it's pretty clear that the state becomes both the object and the facilitator of private power. And some of you know, of course, when there was that huge flood or hurricane down in New Orleans, that's when she first wrote about the shock doctrine. And because of the chaos and the crisis that was going on, private interests were able to privatize part of the education system in Louisiana. And that, of course, was a private-public connection. So in the context of the food crisis, remember, some of you probably know this, the World Development Report came out with the theme Agriculture for Development. And what's interesting is the World Development Report that comes out every year had not addressed agriculture in 25 years. So it was quite fascinating that this report came out at the time. And one of its key recommendations was to encourage value chain agriculture, and particularly in the Global South. The Food Summit in 2008, which I was at, pointed out that it was important for smallholders to take advantage of high food prices across the world to integrate with national and global markets. And Jacques Diouf, the Director General of the FAO, said, high food prices are an excellent opportunity for investment in agriculture by both public and private sectors. So I think you know where I'm going with this. It was a very interesting turning point, if you like, and I think the shock doctrine is part of the story. And the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, in which La Via Campesina is the largest body, put out this declaration. It's called the Terra Preta Declaration. The serious and urgent food and climate crises are being used by political and economic elites as opportunities to entrench corporate control of world agriculture and the ecological commons. And just an interesting side note there, that statement, which was larger than just this sentence, was crafted by me and Shamali Gattal, who is now the director of Focus on the Global South in Thailand. The Terra Preta Forum was the alternative food summit. We weren't allowed in the FAO. These were all the food sovereignty folks across the world, and it was quite fascinating. We were housed in the old abattoirs in Rome, and which were still a little stinky, but it was kind of fun. We were all together, and the FAO allowed a delegation from the Terra Preta Forum, the social movements group, to come into the FAO to pass on the recommendations that we'd been formulating. And what was interesting was that they weren't allowed in, the delegation weren't allowed in through the front door, they had to come in through the back door. And the people they were making the recommendations to were not the big shots who were upstairs in another room making their own plans. So we were kind of effectively marginalized, but it was a very important meeting in terms of developing social movement networks around food sovereignty, etc. So what I want to now do is to make the point that I'm trying to think through about how the corporate food regime was being reconfigured during this particular period, particularly after the Doha stalemate in 2008, when the G20, largely orchestrated by India, China, and Russia and Brazil, I mean India, China and Brazil really, who were pointing out that the global north was incredibly hypocritical in protecting its agriculture, but expecting the global south to liberalize its own farm sectors to allow food dumping as well as investment in agro-export platforms. So the G8 came along in 2008, where is it? 2012 it was actually, and established the Group of Eight, of course, the powerful global north nations, including Russia at the time, the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, which was established in Africa, and I see it as an operation of the shock doctrine, given the context of the food crisis and the way in which the World Bank and the FAO were moving into encouraging investment in smallholders across Africa and elsewhere in value chain or agriculture. So this was a cross-national agricultural growth corridor that was established. Several of these corridors of small producers incorporated into value chains, enclosing land in 10 countries with the help of more than 100 corporate partners. And you can probably figure out who they were. The G8 was reshaping African state policy for land access, in other words, encouraging state rulers to redefine their policy towards the land, to open it up, to guarantee global food supplies, and renew the development industry's legitimacy because of the food crisis. The British Prime Minister said, we're going to unleash the power of the private sector. And what's interesting about the legitimacy issue is that in 2008, because of the food crisis, the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty really put a lot of pressure on the FAO and the UN's Committee on World Food Security to allow the civil society movements to have access to that deliberating forum. And because of the food crisis and because of the shaky legitimacy, the UN allowed the civil society mechanism to be formed, constituted by agrarian social movements in particular, as well as some progressive NGOs, but the progressive, and I've been working with them since 2011, the progressive NGOs tend to be, have to take their cues from the social movements who are really representing constituencies on the front line in the food crisis at the time and continuing. So it's very interesting because that is an instance of the way in which the shock doctrine was operating. There was this organic movement from below, from the social movements in agrarian regions, to gain some voice in the UN. They didn't want to vote. They didn't want to be caught having to make votes. They wanted to just have a voice so they could put their own governments under pressure to take seriously land reform, to take seriously land rights, to take seriously rights to food production. Not just rights to food, but rights to produce food. In other words, allow peasants to stay on the land. So what's going on here, I'm arguing, is that public-private partnerships via direct subsidized investment by agribusiness become the new institutional mechanism of the corporate food regime. And just to exemplify that, a related development was the United Nations Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, with agribusiness lobbies and food corporations such as those various ones there in the last two lines. So now I want to talk in a couple of slides about AGRA as an exemplar. During the Rome Summit in 2008, the Director General secured a pivotal deal for AGRA in Africa. I mean, AGRA had formed in around 2006, but this was really important deal. This kind of philanthrocapitalism, I mean, Gates provided 100 million and Rockefeller 50 million to start with to set AGRA up. The whole idea was to establish 10,000 agro dealers for value chain farming across Africa, with states contributing public credit, with support from the G8, the World Bank, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the African Development Bank for the agricultural sector. ODA funds, that's overseas development assistance funds, were to go to public infrastructure to enable private investment. So there's the partnership at work. Grain said at the time, a little bit earlier, when AGRA was formed, the logic is staggering. The idea is to fund public breeders to develop new varieties because private breeders weren't prepared to do it, to fund private companies to sell these to farmers and provide credit to farmers for purchase of these seeds. AGRA is all about creating an effective demand for its own product, prescribing a model of development that is not able to survive on its own. So that's an interesting characterization, if you can get your mind around it. The AGRA connection, over the last 15 years, has involved more than $500 million promoting commercial seeds, chemical fertilizers, pesticides in 13 African countries, with the permission of the governments, of course, and there's the public-private partnership, as well as $1 billion of government subsidies coming from those countries, those governments, as well as from organizations like the G8 and the World Bank, etc. There's a bit of a controversy that's been brewing. Maybe it's a little storm in the teacup, but it's interesting that AGRA has not released its promised 2020 progress report. And Tim Wise, as some of you know, has been following this very closely. And he came up with this report from the Global Development and Environment Institute, pointing out that maize productivity has increased only 29% across these countries versus the 100% that was expected. At the same time, there's been a 30% increase in malnourished people. In Rwanda, where the maize yield was actually higher, 36%, malnutrition increased 13%, the president, Kalibata, is now the chair of AGRA, was the chair of AGRA, but is now convening a food system summit next year, which I'm going to talk about. So there's an interesting connection there between Agnes Kalibata as a president of Rwanda, or prime minister, and president of AGRA, now coming into the whole UN process. Meanwhile, in the meantime, corporate oligarchy has been evolving, concentrating, centralizing. So seeds, pesticides, Bayer, Monsanto, Corteva, Syngenta, which ChemChina bought out recently. Meat, Tyson Foods, Cargill, JBS, and WH Group, Smithfield Foods, which China's involved with also. And corn, Cargill and ADM, Archer Daniel Midlands, are the oligarchies in each of those particular areas of the food sector. And each group has more than 50% control, which is quite staggering. Corporate capture peaked in 2015, but as ETC says, while the bête noire of the food chain used to be Monsanto at one end and Walmart at the other, we now see mergers via speculative investment by asset managers such as BlackRock, Carlyle Group, and others. In this context, we're seeing financial and digital technological competition centralizing corporate power using buyouts, which I see as enclosures of green ventures, relaxing corporate social responsibility, environmental and nutritional standards. Meanwhile, enclosure at a distance, since the WTO, global production of corns increased 100%, soybeans 200%, rice 35%, and wheat 25%. So it gives you some idea of the kind of monoculture of corn and soybeans across the world that is so pervasive in much of the processed food that everybody eats. Argentina adopted GMOs in 1996 and is now the third largest soy exporter. Amalia Leguizamon, who's at Tulane University, has just produced a new book called Seeds of Power, which is fascinating. And she points out that in the Pampas, they are farmed from a distance with the aid of satellites and high-tech instruments by professionals and entrepreneurs who farm from the comfort of urban settings and IT offices, transcending the urban-rural divide by modernization of the countryside. It's a book worth reading. It's not particularly long, but it's incredible. She also has this interesting angle. She's been working on and with women who are affected by these soy fields and the chemicals. She points out that mothers concerned with child health risks from agrochemicals, these women bring to the table a way of knowing risk that is different from modern corporate-sponsored science. It emerges from felt, lived experience of taking care of loved ones, of gathering data constantly on their children. And I don't think I need to say much about that, but it's quite an interesting distinction there that she's making about how agriculture and its effects are understood and learned and known and experienced. Just a couple of things on global health crisis that's related in part to her book. The oversupply of processed derivatives of corn, soy, monocropping contribute to diabetes, chronic heart disease. Globally, 1 in 3 citizens are obese, 1 in 6 hungry. The US CDC report recently argued that 49% of COVID hospital patients with pre-existing hypertension came in with pre-existing hypertension, 48% obesity and 28% diabetes. So these things kind of, they accumulate, and we're seeing a quite serious and multifaceted global health crisis that's related to a lot of the things I've been talking about. So we've had these recent warnings. In 2018, the Inter-Academy Partnership, which involves about over 100 science institutes, referring to the broken global food system, rising public health failures, obesity and ecosystem degradation. And of course, Jennifer Clapp in May wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times developing that idea of the broken food system. The EAT-Lancet Commission reported global food production threatens climate stability and ecosystem resilience and constitutes the single largest driver of environmental degradation and transgression of planetary boundaries. Taken together, the outcome is dire. A radical transformation of the global food system is urgently needed. That was last year. So this kind of recognition is beginning to take hold, and it's going to be interesting to see how and where it goes. Meanwhile, last year, Eric Holt Jimenez, the director then of the Food First Institute in Oakland, California, said the global food system is not broken. It's working precisely as a capitalist food system is supposed to work. It expands constantly, concentrating wealth in a few powerful monopolies, while transferring all of the social and environmental costs onto society. And that's not all that different in different words from the ISTED report that came out in 2008, and which mentioned that markets do not value social and environmental costs. What we do know is that the majority of food is locally produced across the world, and what's actually being broken is the integrity of such territorial food systems, which I mentioned earlier. When I show that pie chart to my undergraduates, they're pretty amazed. The general data for Africa is that 80% of African food is produced by smallholders. Some in peri-urban centers in particular, some of the cities in Africa are surrounded by such people, and then of course those people who are still on the land. So with COVID and the broken food system, we're seeing the exposure of vulnerabilities of food import dependency very clearly. Some states and public discourses are now revaluing short supply chains and local provisioning, which is, I think, is about time, as export restrictions shrink the food trade. Meanwhile, the big agencies are trying to protect the global food supply chain, and I'm not saying they shouldn't, because of hunger, then there needs to be the redistribution of food to places where people are hungry because of food dependency. Nevertheless, there's this sort of general refrain that we need to avoid disruptions of the corporate-controlled global food supply chains. And of course, as you're probably figuring out, that to me anticipates another kind of shock doctrine initiative. Oh, here we go. So, and this is going on right now. The FAO and the World Economic Forum, which you know is the elite forum, political and economic elites who meet in Davos every January. The FAO is forming a partnership to stage the UN World Food Summit in 2021 with Agnes Kalibata, the president of AGRA, as a convener. So that's sort of telling you something right off the bat. Civil society organizations, hundreds of them, have signed on to a general statement saying the WEF has emerged as a key space for decision makers and corporate leaders to roll out initiatives around what's called global public goods, water, food, and climate, to shape the future of a wide range of services. Meanwhile, the International Panel of Experts on Sustainability of Food Systems said last year the real goal of the summit is to manufacture a new consensus, put business-led solutions back in the driving seat, and shift the locus of food systems governance away from the UN's Committee on World Food Security. Meanwhile, the civil society mechanism, which I work with, is facing marginalization. And there's a lot of organization and mobilization that's going on to attempt to push back against the withdrawal of the FAO, essentially, through the CFS, the UN, from global civil society and its needs, particularly the social movements who are representing small farmers on the front lines of ecological crisis as well as food deficits. Meanwhile, the shock doctrine's deepening. The WEF is talking about a global platform for public-private cooperation, where private corporations are seen as trustees of society, which is quite extraordinary. Klaus Schwab, the director, has published this book, COVID-19, The Great Reset, which challenges elites to make good use of the pandemic by not letting the crisis go to waste. Naomi Klein couldn't have said it better. Meanwhile, the WEF has this agri-food reset sets of partnerships with these various companies, corporations, leading to increased genetic engineering, lab-made proteins. We see that with the whole meat industry stuff, pharmaceuticals and chemicals, sustainable solutions to food health issues. That's how they represent it. And my question is, sustainable for whom? For what? WEF's vision for agriculture, shaping the future of global public goods, published in 2020. And the United Nations Environmental Programme says it's an initiative led by 29 global partner companies addressing major challenges of global food and agricultural sustainability. And this is just a group, not the whole 29, but you can see some very familiar names there. Meanwhile, FIAN has Food First International has made this point that there's a fourth industrial revolution now in food, which is blurring physical, digital, and biological spheres. And this involves the dematerialization of food, where value is increasingly concentrated in marketing. The digitalization of food, which is increasingly automated, delocalized, informatized, probably a better way of pronouncing it. Controlling production and consumers at a distance, which we've already talked about a little bit. But of course, the surveillance that is ongoing with digitalization is so pervasive and Shoshana Zuboff's large book talks a lot about this and the way in which it's used to obtain data on consumers like us at a distance, our preferences, etc. And then, of course, there's the financialization of food, and flex crops has been one example of that, where land is used either for food crops, feed crops for animals, or fuel crops. And the people making the decisions in boardrooms, they don't care about what's being produced. Whichever is producing the highest price is going to be what's going to be produced on that land. So that's why flex crops, that's where the concept comes from. I recently read something about digital fencing in Brazil, where financial companies are using cadastral surveys digitally to identify areas of land that could be become private property, bought up for agro-industrialization purposes, etc. So the question here is, are we seeing agriculture without farmers being complemented by agriculture without humans? Agriculture without farmers was coined by La Via Campesina, and I think is a terrific phrase because it sort of captures the whole point that industrial agriculture removes the knowledge and skills from farmers themselves and commercializes it, of course, with agro-inputs. And so farmers, say in value chain agriculture, become effectively workers on land that they previously worked themselves with their own knowledge. So this brings up the question of the control biopolitics of food manufacture, social diets, public health, and generally of modern life worlds and the way in which digitalization is beginning to transform how we live, how we relate socially, etc. Just to finish, many of you know Nettie Weeb. She was the only woman on the original coordinating committee of La Via Campesina. And she, of course, she was actually the inspiration to me when I was at a meeting in Mexico City against the Cancun WTO summit, food summit, and social movements were organizing against it. And I met Nettie there, and she talked about her relationship to the food sovereignty movement. And I was so fascinated that she sold it to me. I didn't pay her, but it's a movement of people of the land who share a progressive agenda, which means we share the view that people have a right to be there, that it's our job to look after the earth and our people. We must defend it, and we have to defend it in the global context. And I think that phrasing is still very appropriate today. So that's it, Yildiz. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for this very comprehensive, historically oriented talk. I think I have to turn my, I have to show my picture too.
Say stop video.
Yes, here we go. Thanks so much. Really, it was really, I was taking a lot of notes, so I sort of forget that you were about to finish too. Okay. So yeah, I am opening this floor for questions and answers right now. We have 3 questions posted on the question and answer button. We also have 1 question posted on the chat, which I sort of just saw. Why don't we start with these notes? Gabriela, would you like to read the first comment on Canadian teachers' pension funds, please?
Sure. Hi. That was a great talk. So the first comment was Canadian teachers' pension funds purchase water and land in Australia.
Oh my
God. Amanda was mentioning that when you mentioned, I believe, what was happening in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How could a Commonwealth country do that to Australia?
Yeah. Okay. So I would like to sort of move to the second question, written by Kasım Tirmizi. I'm sure I butchered your name, and I apologize for this. He says that the concept of life world enclosures you seem to indicate shows constitutes of enclosures across the three FRs. Are enclosures different in different FRs? And how does this concept change from how you think about FRs now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's what I'm puzzling about myself. So I'll see what I can do. You know, I did try to separate out the dominant forms of enclosure in the three food regimes. But of course, I mean, I often like to say that capitalism has a generic food regime, and just distinguishing periods is one thing, which I think is an important geopolitical exercise. But on the other, and about hegemony, different forms of hegemony. But on the other hand, you know, the enclosure of frontiers in the late 19th century in the New World were clearly the sort of dominant form of enclosure at that time. But it continues, and, you know, as Standing Rock protests and various other movements by indigenous peoples today are trying to point out that this kind of enclosure, not just of land, but also enclosure of possibilities and so forth, is ongoing. And it's true for all post-colonial peoples, including Black folks in the United States. So the Black Lives Matter, I think, appeals a little bit to that, but that's another story. So then moving on to the second food regime that Harriet and I talked about was really about dumping cheap food from the United States, surpluses in particular third world countries. And what I'm trying to get at there is that such dumping was leading to the undermining of smallholder cultures, not everywhere, but sufficiently to make the point that that's another form of enclosure because it reduces the possibility of people to maintain you know, their historic and traditional and cultural livelihood. The other part of it was green revolution technology, which I think is another form of enclosure, which is a technological enclosure, as I mentioned right at the end there, that dispenses with local farming knowledges and dispenses with local ecologies. For example, I always remember Vandana Shiva saying that under the green revolution technology, green leafy vegetables, which are essential to vitamins, you guys might say vitamins, but I say vitamins. I'm from the global south, actually, from Australia. So that those nutrients in those green leafy vegetables disappeared because they were designated as weeds, and they were sprayed to allow the monocultures of wheat and rice. So do you see what I'm getting at? So the technology was undermining a certain way of producing food, and particular farming cultures. And then thirdly, you know, the frontier movement, as well as the dumping, as well as the technology, has now become global. And so those things are all entwined, I think. And, you know, and of course, the way in which agribusiness has evolved and concentrated and now become digitalized, etc. And IPES Food has some terrific reports on this about gene drives and you know, digital agriculture, etc. And all of that, I think, is a, you know, is a cumulative an acceleration, if you like, of the undermining of farming with nature as opposed to farming against nature, to put it really quickly.
Thank you so much. Before we move to the other question, since we are talking about the digitally enforced enclosures, as you know, there are lots of emphasis nowadays on climate smart agriculture and Green New Deal. And as you know, the Jeremy Rifkin also wrote a book about that. And then they are really, especially Jeremy Rifkin, I feel that he is really pushing forward with the digitally enhanced ecological farming idea. And also, I feel that actually there is a connection between biotechnology intensification and Internet of Things approach to sort of promote this idea of ecologically smart agriculture. Could you please also comment on that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm not it's not an area of my own research. I did read Tony Weiss's book on it a few years ago when I taught it to my graduate students. But I think the point there is that those technologies are being introduced by the private sector, I like to say often to cover their tracks or to become legitimate by claiming they're involved in climate smart agriculture. And to take that further, some of those technologies aren't necessarily bad if they were commonly owned, if they were democratically owned and used so that farmers who actually work the land, as opposed to the companies that provide the technologies, but have very little relationship to the land and the ecological consequences. So that's the other point. And then the further point that I think Tony makes is that they have these various criteria that are used to claim that one particular area is practicing climate smart agriculture, another particular area is practicing it in a different way. And the critique from the social movements is that there's no singular form of climate smart agriculture. Now that might relate to different regional and ecosystem settings, but I know that that's their critique, that companies and farming, industrial agriculture setups may adopt one particular form of technology or digitalized technology that they claim is climate smart. And so that whole thing becomes called climate smart agriculture, and it reproduces the power relations that are implicit in the corporate food regime, agribusiness.
Thank you so much. Gabriela, would you like to read the next question?
Sure. So this is from Amanda. She asks, do you think that the food system can change positively without a major reorientation of the economy to local markets? Can we retain some of the benefits of a globalized food chain and still have justice in the food supply chains?
Wow, that's a good question too, and there's a number of different dimensions there. Well, let me answer the first part, the last part first, and that is to emphasize that the accounting of the emissions from transport of food across the world doesn't take place. So we don't know how the incredible transport of food, increases global greenhouse gas emissions. And I think we do, but it's not accounted for formally. And so that's one thing to mention. I was really struck when I was on sabbatical in Oxford and buying organic food in the local supermarkets. Sainsbury was one of the supermarkets I was purchasing it. I was thinking, gee, English food was always probably the worst that I ever had because I grew up on it in Australia. But all of a sudden the English are eating organic food, and then I found out that it was coming from Western China. And that made me think again about the whole point about transporting food that could be grown locally. There's no need to have to produce it en masse as a profitable enterprise as opposed to feeding people. So yeah, so I think there's a problem there, and I'm not discounting the need for some countries that are food dependent. They can't turn it around so quickly to embrace local food. Sophia Murphy's work is really good on this, and I've always liked how she makes this point, that it's important to recognize that not all some states are more equal than others essentially, and some states still need to depend on global food supplies. But I think in the future, I think we're going to see much more local food production and consumption, and circular food systems. I ran across that in Brisbane in 2018, where I was introduced to some farmers who were producing food for local urban restaurants, and in turn taking the food waste from those restaurants and using it as compost for their farming. So it was a really interesting way of maintaining a circular food system. So I think there's a lot of experimentation going on like that. Unfortunately, governments are not supporting it, and it's going to have to become significantly present to really force governments to recognize that this is important. I think it's going to become necessary because the global food system as it is not sustainable. That's kind of a roundabout answer.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Gabriela, another one? Another question?
Yes. I apologize. I cannot pronounce this name. But the next question asks, thank you so much for the talk. I am wondering whether and how the trade dispute between the US and China in the past 2 years has reconfigured the corporate food regime.
I don't think I have an answer for that. I don't think it's reconfigured. I don't think it's reconfigured it. I think it's been a shot across the bow of both countries. The only thing I would say is that since I did write something on China's entry into the food regime at the beginning of this year, it was published, that China is being very clever at diversifying its access to food offshore. China is very concerned about food security for its population in the future. And at the moment, they're much more focused on Southeast Asia and Central Asia as the origin of food supplies offshore. They're also getting deals from Russia now too. So it's really interesting to see how the movement of food around the world is changing as the Chinese are getting more involved in securing food supplies. Yeah. So I think it's too premature to say that it's changing the food regime. I do argue in that article that China is modeling a state-centered form of supporting food security in its own country in particular, but it also has a what it argues as a benign relationship to governments where it's investing in their food systems in Southeast Asia to bring back to China. In Africa, not so much, more to encourage the expansion of food production via smallholder agriculture to ensure the world supply of food is not going to be in a crisis mode in future years, and China won't be able to get food from elsewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, before the next question, could you also comment on this? So we have this corporate-led system, as you laid out quite nicely, quite beautifully. But also you also sort of talked about the resistance movements coming from food sovereignty people from global south and peasant-led food systems, etc. When I do my research, I do my research based on Turkey. Many of these small-scale peasant-like producers are integrated into a corporate-led business. At least, if nothing else, at least they have to buy their commercial seeds because there are seed laws implemented in Turkey since at least 2006. So as a result, when we see the peasant-like producers being part of this corporate-led regime, how actually can we think about the peasant-led oppositional, transformational movement in that context? Yeah.
Well, two things. One is, Yildiz, I think that the peasant movement, wants to preserve its right to produce food on its own terms, and it's obvious that, as I kind of alluded much earlier in the talk, that when I had that pie chart, that territorial food systems, peasant-based food systems, are under a lot of pressure. And one way in which they address that pressure, I mean, there's two ways. One is off-farm work that many peasant families have to engage in just to bring in money for education, etc. But also, in some places, they're forced to join that kind of value chain relationship, which begins to erode their own knowledges. So yeah, it's a transitional process, and it's happening elsewhere also. I think it's problematic, obviously, but and the food sovereignty movement does too. But what's interesting about what's going on in Europe, they do have seed laws there with the European agricultural setup. I had a grad student, Elisa De Via, an Italian woman who's terrific, and she's now teaching in Leiden in the Netherlands, where the food's also shitty, except for the Indonesian food. But and she's Italian, so she's suffering. She did her research in Spain, Italy, and France, and worked with local farming groups, smallholders who are cooperating together, and sharing seeds illegally, but nevertheless effectively, and creating a peasant farming culture, which Jan van der Ploeg would call repeasantization, and developing enduring relationships with urban consumers. And it was a fascinating study because she was actually trying to develop van der Ploeg's work. But I ran into him at a conference a little bit later and mentioned her work. And he said, oh yeah, it's fascinating. There's more food being produced under the radar in Europe than is produced by agribusiness. And that's the positive sign, I think, that people are taking matters into their own hands and trying to retain their connections and their networks. And I think that's, we're going to see more of that. Of course, it depends on access to land and whatever.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, that's absolutely true. When I interview the small scale farmers, etc., they find their own actually value chains outside the state-led system, and they are doing fantastically well, for sure.
Yeah, good for them.
And they were also able to support their livelihoods financially too. Yeah, very good.
And I think the point I'm making is that I think it's really important to try and preserve those knowledge practices because they're potentially really ecologically oriented. I mean, obviously, small farmers are not perfect, in part because of the conditions they face. But I think retaining that kind of ecological farming is really essential for the future.
Yes, thank you. Gabriella, could you continue?
Thank you. So the next question is by Adrienne. So she says, thank you for a very interesting talk. Would you consider the vertical integration taking place in certain industries, such as in poultry or pig production, to be a form of enclosure?
Absolutely, Adrienne. Thanks for asking that question, because I mentioned livestock factory farming right at the beginning, if you remember, and that was what I was alluding to. It's really incredible that these small farmers who are being contracted by processors and retailers to produce food, I mean, particularly poultry and beef cattle, etc., are really under the gun, and they're not doing very well at all. It's a relationship that has kind of destroyed their love of farming. There was a film that came out last year about that. I think it was called Eating Animals, and whoever made it gave me access to it so I could show it to my students. But I had a grad student, Carrie Freshour, who's a professor assistant professor at University of Washington, who actually worked in a chicken processing factory in Georgia, where she's from. She worked undercover. She's a vegetarian, and she was the eviscerator on the line. So I don't know how she did it, but she saw what was going on in the chicken processing factory, and she was actually most interested not in the chickens themselves, but in the women who were working on the line and how they handled the pressure and what kind of relationship they had to their communities outside of the factory time.
Yeah. And also, I mean, if I may add to this, I mean, there is this, as we all know, there's this very strong movement towards veganism. But I think that actually, rather than pointing the animals as a problem, I think we should be also thinking about how to integrate animals in a holistic way to the maintenance of lands and soils, etc. Also.
Exactly, and that's what's been broken, of course, that's metabolic rift in part, where animals provide the manure and eat the stubble and whatever they do. I'm not a farmer myself, but I think that's it's unfortunate that we now factory farm, and of course it's ripe for viruses, etc. And it's inhumane to animals too, obviously.
Thank you. And we have a question from Harriet Friedman. Gabriela, would you like to read this?
Sure. Okay, so the next question, it's a bit long, so bear with me. What timeline do you see for broken or unsustainable food system? Related, what about discourse of reviving economy or bouncing back? In spring, I was encouraged in Toronto by the creativity of territorial farm-based networks, plus what ought to be the obvious vulnerability of cross-border supply chains once the border closed to people. But the border didn't close to goods. The supermarkets are now reporting record profits, and food prices are high, but shelves are stocked. Frontline food workers in farms and supermarkets are dying of COVID, but not much is done. Agricultural supports from federal government have gone to big farmers and to Cargill, just after its Alberta meat packing plant was closed due to COVID.
Wow, I'm not sure what the question is, because I got caught up in the details of the rest of the statement. I'm not sure who Dr. Friedman is, but
I could ask again. Do you want me to repeat the first question?
Yeah, can you figure out what the question is for me?
Sure. So the question is, what timeline do you see for broken or unsustainable food system? Related, what about discourse of reviving economy or bouncing back?
The Biden thing of build back better, that kind of stuff, I guess, what Harriet's getting at. I don't have a timeline. I think it may come sooner than we expect, because I think that the combined crises are accelerating, and so I can't really make a prediction in those terms. I think it's because of what we're experiencing now. I think that there's a lot of new experimentation at the local level that's going on, and as I said, that how that becomes significant is a huge and difficult question to really answer. But insofar as governments are quite vulnerable to food crises, then if the global food supply chains break down continually, then I think that we will see some kind of mandate or what have you, support going to supporting local food systems. And so that's probably about all I can say on that matter. It's a very difficult question to think through in the future, but I am very concerned that at the same time, given my use of the shock doctrine idea, that the small farming groups, movements, as well as those on the land, are being put in a very vulnerable position by what's the maneuvering that's going on between the very big companies, the UN agencies, the World Bank, etc., and various governments. I mean, I was really struck last year at the and Harriet, you were there, I think. You were in the FAO at the Committee on World Food Security meeting, when I heard the ambassador to the FAO from the United States, whose name is Kip Tom, and he's a producer of some kind of genetically modified food. And the agroecology report was being put forward and voted on with a majority from governments. And he was very disparaging at a side event that I went to listen to, and said that's not progress. And of course, at the same time, the other folks who were on his side were essentially arguing that agroecology is just one tool in a toolbox that we need to maintain. And of course, that goes back to, you know, the discussion about climate smart agriculture, etc. But no, I can't give you a clear timeline, Harriet, I'm sorry.
Gabriela, would you like to read Harriet's follow-up question before we ask the question from Michael and Dana?
Sure. So Harriet's follow-up question is, the supply chains are not breaking down for those who can afford what is in the supermarkets. There is more hunger. So how can the politics change?
Oh God, I mean, that's something Harriet should answer, not me.
I like that. Okay. All right. So, Harriet, we would like to hear your answer to that question, if you don't mind to type here on the in the box, or maybe in the chat box. Mm-hmm. So, shall we move to Michael's question along? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
For sure. Next question by Michael. Are you at all worried that broad critiques or animal farming might undermine grazing economies in ways that may lead to breaking of grasslands, the most endangered ecosystems on the planet? Animals may also be integral to agroecological, political mixed farming systems. It is complicated, no?
Yes.
Yes.
I am concerned about that, and I mean, I think there was a report a couple of years ago in 2018 from Brazil about the way in which the Cerrado, which is the most diverse biome in Brazil, is being reoccupied now for monocultures, and local farmers and fishers are being marginalized. So I mean, that's all happening, and I think it's very concerning. And it all falls under the you know, the discourse of feeding the world, which of course is a lie, because the world's not being fed, and that's what Harriet was partly getting at. The food system is organized in a very unequal fashion, so that those who can afford it, those with purchasing power, can get their food. And this is why I think the food sovereignty movement is so important in pushing for not the right to food, which means, in American terms, the right to purchase food, but the right to produce food. And I'm hoping that is going to dawn on people that that's a very important right. And of course, it refers to farmers with knowledge. It doesn't refer to digital corporations or financiers producing flex crops.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Dana, James has a question. She says, in line with the shock doctrine, do you see evidence of COVID increasing land grabs?
Not really. I've been too busy to follow what's going on in that regard. Maybe the person who answered the question has the answer. That's often what happens. You ask a question because you know the answer, right? Just, so, I mean, I do know that on Long Island, for example, in the United States, a lot of local farming operations, local farmers have been doing very well because because restaurants can't buy food because they're shut. People are not using restaurants, and so those farmers that were providing mass monocultural crops to provide various restaurants in New York, for example, in that region, were not doing very well. In the meantime, local farmers markets have been flourishing. There was an article in the New York Times that addressed that last year. It was quite fascinating. So that's something that I think, you know, partly answers the question.
I mean, to echo your comment on this, I feel the same way about Turkey too. I mean, when I keep talking with farmers I'm in contact with over there. Small farmers who rely on their own labor are not affected by this at all. But the other one who relies on migrant labor are feeling the pressure of COVID more.
That's right. Yeah, well, 25% of the world's farm workers are migrants. And that's a considerable amount, and certainly in Southern Europe, that's become a big problem because a lot of small farmers in Southern Europe have been surviving by being able to employ very cheap migrant labor, and therefore to be able to stay in the game and provide food supply food retailers and processors. But that's breaking down at the moment because of the COVID and the migrant issue.
Thank you. Brian Dale has a question. Gabby, would you like to read?
Sure. Thanks for the great talk. You mentioned your involvement in food sovereignty initiatives. What role do you feel academics have to play, particularly given the urgency of the situation facing the food system in terms of global hunger, the climate crisis, etc.? It seems that there is a real tension between the slow process of teaching academic analysis and the speed of systemic change that is needed.
Yeah, that's a very well worded question, and it's obvious that it's something that Harriet and I have both been thinking about over the years. And I mean, the two things I'd say: one is to get involved locally, and of course Harriet was very involved with the Toronto Food Council, we have a bunch of CSAs here in Ithaca and a farmers market, and I've been involved in a food dignity project, which is about ensuring low-income people have access to food. So that's one thing that got me away from my desk, so to speak. And the other thing, two other things. One is I've been working since 2011 with the civil society mechanism in Rome, and writing a couple of reports and working collaboratively, not telling them what to do, but doing whatever they ask for me to do. That's been fascinating because it's introduced me to a whole range of folks who know a lot more about the food system than I do as an academic. A lot of young people in particular who interdisciplinary, and that's not even the right term, but you know what I'm getting at. They don't sort of, neither historians or sociologists or scientists of one kind or another, they sort of put it all together. And they're really interesting and very active, brilliant people. So that sort of humbled me to some extent in terms of the work I was doing. So that's the second part. And the third part, I think, is I guess my work in its own way has become more political over the years. And I learned a lot of that, not only talking to Harriet about her work in Toronto, but the graduate students that I was working with at Cornell were all doing field work, which I was an archivist writing a dissertation. So I learned a lot from their connections and relationships and experiences with people on the ground, particularly since I'm in the ag school. They were doing a lot of work with farming communities, etc. So that helped me, I think, to begin to gesture towards being involved in anti-WTO activity, where I met Nettie Weeb, as I mentioned. And so that kind of thing, I think, became very important. And it was for that reason that, in 2011, I was approached by a member of FIAN who said, please come and join the CSM, and because you seem to get what we're doing, even though I was doing it from an ivory tower, so to speak. And so that's, those are three things I think you can think about. And I totally agree with the issue of time. Time is so precious now.
Thank you. Gaby, would you like to read Harriet's comment?
Yes, so her comment goes back to her last question. All I meant goes back to politics of shock doctrine. Corporate influence seems at least as strong as ever, locking in what works for them.
Exactly.
And
that's my concern. And I think that one of the things that's going to be interesting over the next year is going to be the way in which the civil society mechanism in the CFS is able to make some kind of dent in that lockdown. One can be either depressed about it or be hopeful. I'm hopeful.
The following question follows this quite nicely. Gabby?
Thank you so much for sharing your thinking and your analysis. I'm interested in hearing more on your thoughts of the digital fencing piece and how you see it contributing to a deepening shock doctrine.
Oh boy. Well, I'll give you an example. Actually, it's from Naomi Klein. She wrote something in The Guardian last year, which I thought was really interesting. And she was talking about the way in which Apple and Google and Amazon in particular, but other AI and IT companies are putting pressure on Governor Cuomo in New York State to establish a public-private partnership around building a digital infrastructure for the state to be used by the government to, probably, pay for service, obviously. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. To manage and regulate education and public health and things like that. And it's a very interesting article because she notices that the digital industry in the early 2000s basically represented themselves as providing convenience to us all. We didn't need to leave the bed. You could just play with your phone and order food and God knows what. And then, around 2013, when the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative was emerging, they began realizing the Chinese were getting in on the digital revolution. And so it became a competitive issue to these companies. And presumably they've been putting pressure on the federal government. But now she says they're getting involved in actually trying to reorganize how we live. And that's the example I'm giving from New York State. And I think that's becoming much more serious and very concerning. And it just sort of sets up a whole power structure, an infrastructure of power that is very difficult to dismantle and could be actually used for good social purposes if it wasn't so privately owned by a bunch of monopolies. And of course, Amazon is the big one.
Thank you so much. Gabby, would you like to read the sort of comments as well, listed on the chat box, because they're quite nice actually, yeah.
So Gerardo Otero says, great to see you, Philip, welcome. Oh, that was the first one, sorry. And then Laura Marks says, that was fabulous. Gonzali Durma says, thank you very much. Lisa Giordani says, the analysis of Brazil are perfect. The whole presentation was very enlightening. Sigrid, let's see, what an incredible talk, compelling historical and contemporary summary of these issues. Thank you so much, Philip. From Jamie Peck, thank you for the great talk. Amanda Shankland says, your papers were a great help to me in teaching food politics to my students. The regime's model is a great way of structuring the history. I agree, though, that we are in a fourth digital technological regime now, and maybe you will have to add another regime to your work. Thank you, Philip. Michael Gertler says, many thanks for this, Phil. Brought my sociology of agriculture and food class to this talk. Looking forward to the article. Laura says, thank you. This has been very enlightening. And she has to leave. And then Dana says, thanks very much, Philip. Great to hear you. Great to hear where your thinking is at.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Gabriella. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for being with us today. It was a fantastic time that your paper was great, questions were great, and thank you again, and thank you for participating in our forum today. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, Yildiz. I really enjoyed seeing you again and hearing from Harriet and seeing Gabriella and hearing from the other folks in the audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Stay safe. Keep safe.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.